Hey guys, Spirit of the Lie here. In this video, we're going to talk about the DLC coming to AoE2 titled Return of Rome. Now right off the top, I have to say I don't have any special insider information regarding what this is, but I know it's been discussed heavily on the forums, and there's a lot of different ideas about what this could look like, as it sounds unlike any DLC we've had before. The first thing we learned about it was on the anniversary livestream, where we heard they'll be, quote, bringing Age of Empires Definitive Edition into the Age of Empires 2 DE engine. Now, engine is a confusing term here, as they're both already on the same Genie engine. But the question then is whether this is going to be like AoE 1 with a few extra features, or is it going to feel like AoE 2? On the Age of Empires forums, there's a poll asking other players what they're hoping for from the DLC, and to what degree it should reflect each game, ranging from as close to AoE 1 as possible, all the way up to being basically AoE 2 civilizations with an ancient theme. Maybe not surprising given this was on the AoE 2 forums, around 60% of respondents wanted either most AoE 2 features or just AoE 2 civilizations with a classical era spin. As close to AoE 1 as possible was dead last. So there you have it, the plebeians have spoken. Remember, this is an AoE 2 DLC. Or is it? Is this a DLC or is it a separate game? We know it's not like a regular DLC adding 2 or 3 civilizations. Something like Dynasties of India is still suggested on the roadmap and implied to be coming out in 2023. But the fact the announcement says this is, quote, adding AoE 1 DE content to AoE 2, it really sounds like a completely separate game mode to me. I imagine, and many others have suggested, that it could just be a separate launcher, where when you start the game, it starts as either AoE 2 DE or Return of Rome, using totally different datasets that couldn't even be played against each other if you wanted to. I'm sorry if this is what you were hoping for, but there is zero chance you're going to be using Centurions against Conquistadors, and it would be insane to try to mix the two civs with each other like that, so I think we can safely rule it out. Whatever this ends up looking like, the AoE 1 civs are 100% going to be just playing against each other. Now, if we take it at face value and that they're straight at bringing AoE 1 into AoE 2 DE, I think a lot of people are going to wonder if that's not what should have happened to begin with AoE 1 Definitive Edition. Why were the devs so adamant about keeping everything in AoE 1 DE so close to the original game if they're just going to update it again to be more like AoE 2 a couple years down the road, and basically just do the project again? Now, a cynical person might say it's to sell the game a third time, but I do think there may have been a good explanation for not giving us an AoE 1 and AoE 2 hybrid the first time around. One factor that a lot of Western players may not be aware of is that AoE 1 is a hit in Vietnam specifically. For example, from Liquipedia, of the big Age of Empires 1 tournaments with prize pools over $1,000 this year, you can see they're basically all in Vietnam. Considering Vietnam's average annual income is about $1,800 a year, it shows that being good at AoE 1 is big business in Vietnam, and that there's obviously a very large following. You can see there's several tournaments per year worth the equivalent of $100,000 tournaments for someone in North America or Northern Europe if you compare median wages. You can see why Vietnam is such a popular destination for digital nomads and expats. So why is AoE 1 so big in Vietnam, and what does that have to do with Definitive Edition and the new DLC? The phenomenon is explained well in an article at fanbyte.com titled Vietnamese Gamers Are Keeping a 20-Year-Old Strategy Game Alive. The short answer seems to be due to weak copyright enforcement, computer salesmen would often put legal, or perhaps not, versions of AoE 1 on computers by default, like you might have Solitaire or Minesweeper. That means a whole lot of people's first experience with computers would have given them some exposure to AoE 1, and hence a lot of nostalgia for that game specifically. Assuming this is an accurate characterization, I have to believe that the plan of sticking as conservatively as possible to AoE 1 mechanics in Definitive Edition may partly have been just wanting to not mess with the formula too much, hoping Definitive Edition would catch on in Vietnam, cashing in on that nostalgia and active scene. Now, Microsoft would know better than I would, but from Steam statistics, it seems that gamble did not pay off. Of all the Age of Empires Definitive Editions, AoE 1 has the smallest player base by a significant margin. At this point, it's a borderline dead game, and doesn't seem to have been picked up widely by Vietnamese fans. With AoE 1 Definitive Edition being perhaps a failed gamble at the Vietnamese market, and AoE 2 fans finding it outdated, it's possible that that's what this DLC is intended to address. Doing it in the AoE 2 engine, for lack of a better word, could signal the addition of formations, gates, pathing improvements, etc., but that's also not necessarily where it stops. What about garrisoning in town centers? That's something the AoE 2 client has and the AoE 1 doesn't, and can also lead to some very frustrating and short games. Likewise, are they sticking with AoE 1 map scripts, or would they start using AoE 2 ones? That may then also imply we're using AoE 2 standard starting resources. As another example, can you buy and sell at the market? And what about trade carts on land as an infinite gold generation system? When you start to look closely, there's a lot of choices they'll have to make about whether this is going to be AoE 1 yet again, or embrace this as an AoE 2 inspired update, as an AoE 1.5 as it were. After thinking about this quite a bit, the crux of it is I don't think there's a way to do an AoE 1.5 where you meet both games in the middle. Even if they bring over all of those features I just mentioned from AoE 2, when you get to the tech tree, you have to make a serious choice. Do you go with the AoE 1 tech tree of Centurions, Chariot Archers, Axemen, and Slingers? It may seem like that's the only way to do it, but in my opinion, that would make this not an AoE 1.5, but an AoE 1.3, leaning more toward AoE 1 than AoE 2. It would still be a game an AoE 2 only player would start and be very lost at the techs, units, and at least some of the game mechanics. Now, this is what almost everyone assumes is going to be happening, and I don't disagree it seems most likely, though the poll suggests this is not what AoE 2 fans want. They want AoE 2, not just AoE 1 again. Alternately, and more radically, if I can dream for a moment, they could instead go from the opposite direction and start with a slightly modified AoE 2 tech tree, maybe renaming the techs to be more fitting with the ancient era, but start there and pull the game slightly in the direction of AoE 1. This would give us what I'd call AoE 1.7, we'll say, landing more toward AoE 2, and where an AoE 2 player would be very comfortable in even their first game. In fact, we have a great example of what that could look like in the Rome at War fan-created mod, as that's what it is. They had to make some tweaks, replacing the hand cannoneer and trebuchet with more ancient era counterparts. The crossbow line is replaced by all archers, knights become cavalrymen. It's not exactly the same, but it can be done with even just superficial changes. Rome at War takes this further with new game mechanics, like doubled up unique techs, though it wouldn't even need to go that far. In this case, they could still preserve the idea of bringing AoE 1 to AoE 2 by having Romans get cheaper towers and faster attack, for example, and have legionaries as their unique unit. It would feel like AoE 2, but with the novelty of using ancient civilizations in their own separate game mode. To my eyes, in this poll, this is what people would be excited about. Though again, this is very likely just a pipe dream, and simply porting over AoE 1 seems to be what we're getting. Personally, I would also greatly prefer the approach of starting from AoE 2, as this is an AoE 2 DLC aimed at people who already own that game. Of course, there is a potential genuine criticism here as well, depending on how it's done, that if they just port AoE 1 over with some minor tweaks, it really could feel like just another attempt to sell you AoE 1 for the third time. Obviously, that concern goes away if the changes are quite large, or if this is free or heavily discounted for AoE 1 Definitive Edition owners, and that may be possible as well. Personally, I'd be surprised, but we can't rule it out entirely. The only way that plan makes the most sense to me is if they're just trying to move over the last few players from Age of Empires 1. Rather than keeping AoE 1 Definitive Edition limping on and doing periodic updates, they can then shut that down and say they just rolled it into AoE 2. Another criticism I've seen if they just port over AoE 1 is that it might actually be a bit misleading, as someone new to AoE 2 might just assume they need all the DLC, and get Dawn of the Dukes, Lords of the West, and just throwing Return of Rome in there as well, not realizing the devs have snuck essentially a version of AoE 1 in the list, tricking them into buying a separate game entirely. I could definitely see someone very casual buying the DLC, thinking they're just getting the Western Roman Empire in AoE 2 as a playable faction. Obviously, just seeing the title doesn't imply it's AoE 1, or we wouldn't be having this discussion. And I mean, the game has Huns after all, and Western Romans are also in the campaigns already, so it's not like including Western Romans in AoE 2 would be completely out of nowhere. Now, if that confusion can be avoided in some way, then maybe having a few DLC campaigns would make it appealing to some AoE 2 players, especially if they were on the same level as AoE 2's campaign quality. It's an established fact that there is a huge number of campaign-only players, and even if it's sold for $10, that's probably worth it to a lot of people just to relive a more palatable and user-friendly version of AoE 1 with some new campaigns telling different stories. Obviously, all of this will be clarified when it comes out in 2023, either early or later in the year, depending on how ambitious they are with it. But those are just my ramblings on the topic, and as someone who loves both AoE 2 and the classical era, I got very excited by this announcement, especially at the possibility it might be an official version of something like Rome at War, though I am becoming less convinced of that every day since. I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts though, and if you're happy with an AoE 1 update, or hoping for something much more like AoE 2. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.